What if everything you were taught about exploration was wrong? What if the greatest ocean crossing of the early Middle Ages was not guided by maps, instruments, or written directions, but by something far older, quieter, and almost impossible to recover today? Imagine standing on the edge of the North Atlantic 1,000 years ago, with no compass to steady your hand, no charts to promise land ahead, and no guarantee that the horizon would ever break open into safety. Only cold water, moving sky, and the knowledge that once you left shore, there was no way to turn back without trusting what could not be seen. The Vikings crossed that ocean anyway. Not once, not by accident, but again and again. From Scandinavia to Iceland, from Iceland to Greenland, and from Greenland to a distant shore they called Vinland. How did they do it? Not with technology as we imagine it today, but with a system of perception so subtle that modern sailors struggle to recognize it. This is not a story about bravery alone. It is a story about how humans learned to read the world itself, when the world offered no instructions. The North Atlantic is not an empty space between lands. It is a living system of currents, winds, fog banks, migrating animals, and shifting light that changes personality by the hour. Even modern vessels equipped with satellite navigation treat it with caution because this ocean does not forgive assumptions. For the Viking sailor, the sea was not an enemy to be conquered, but a pattern to be understood. They did not imagine the ocean as a blank surface. They experienced it as a textured environment, full of signals that only revealed themselves to those who had learned to notice them since childhood. Currents pressed against the hull in distinct ways depending on latitude. Swell patterns shifted direction long before land appeared. Fog did not simply obscure vision, it altered sound, temperature, and even the behavior of birds. To navigate the Atlantic without instruments, one did not look for a single answer. One learned to balance many imperfect clues, none of which were reliable alone, but which together formed a moving picture of where one stood in the world. Viking ships were not passive vehicles. They were built to communicate. The flexible hulls of clinker-built longships responded to waves rather than resisting them, transmitting subtle vibrations through the planks and ribs. Experienced sailors felt changes in water temperature and salinity through the motion of the ship itself. They listened to how the bow met the swell, how the stern lifted or dragged, how the rhythm of the sea shifted beneath them. This was not instinct in the romantic sense. It was learned sensitivity, developed over years of coastal travel before ever attempting an ocean crossing. A Viking navigator did not separate himself from the vessel. The ship became an extension of his senses, translating invisible conditions into physical experience. In this way, navigation was not something done from above with charts and symbols. It was something lived, moment by moment, in the body. The sky was never empty to Viking sailors. It was structured, seasonal, and predictable to those who studied it long enough. The position of the sun at different times of day revealed direction, but more importantly, it revealed latitude when combined with experience. The length of daylight shifted dramatically as one traveled north or south, and this change was memorized rather than measured. Cloud formations told their own stories. High, thin clouds moved differently than low, heavy ones, and their behavior hinted at distant landmasses interrupting airflow far beyond the horizon. Even the color of the sky near sunset changed subtly as reflected light interacted with ice, open sea, or forested land. This was not guesswork. It was pattern recognition refined across generations, passed down through observation rather than writing, preserved in memory rather than ink. Birds did not belong to the sky alone, and to Viking sailors they were never just background life drifting overhead. They were moving signals embedded in the seascape itself. Certain species rarely ventured far from land, while others crossed open water only along routes shaped by season and survival, and knowing the difference meant knowing whether the world ahead was empty or beginning to take form. A flock appearing at the wrong hour, flying low, scattered, or with sudden urgency, could suggest a coastline still hidden beyond fog and distance, long before human eyes could confirm it. Whales surface differently near continental shelves. Seals lingered where currents softened, and even schools of fish altered the skin of the sea, creating subtle changes in color and motion that trained eyes learned to read without naming. Viking sailors did not follow animals as guides in any simple or literal way. They listened to them as part of a larger environmental language, a quiet conversation between water, wind, and life itself. A language without words, but never without meaning. Without maps, memory became infrastructure, not a supplement to navigation, but the system itself, stable only because it was constantly rehearsed and shared. Routes were never drawn on parchment or carved into wood. They were carried as sequences of lived experience, remembered through sensation rather than measurement. The feel of the wind after 3 days at sea, the way it pressed colder and steadier from a familiar direction, the faint smell of ice carried long before it could be seen, the angle of the sun when fatigue settled into the body and told its own truth about distance traveled. These memories were spoken aloud, repeated across generations, until they no longer belonged to one sailor, but to the community as a whole. Errors were preserved as carefully as triumphs, because forgetting failure meant inviting it back. In this way, entire settlements carried fragments of navigational knowledge, each person holding part of the route in their mind. This system never removed uncertainty. It learned to live with it and treated uncertainty not as weakness, but as a permanent companion at sea. Modern navigation slowly erased the need to feel the world so closely, not through failure, but through convenience that rewarded speed over awareness. Instruments replaced attention, charts replaced memory, and coordinates replaced stories that once carried meaning across generations. As these tools grew more precise, the older skills began to fade, not because they stopped working, but because they demanded patience, humility, and long exposure to uncertainty, qualities efficiency rarely values. What remains today are fragments rather than a living system. A brief mention preserved in a saga, a structural clue embedded in ship design, a recurring pattern noticed by archaeologists and experimental sailors attempting to retrace these routes. Each fragment hints at a way of thinking rather than a set of instructions. In the end, we are not reconstructing a technique that can be copied. We are trying to recover a mindset shaped by attention, memory, and trust in the natural world. Archaeology gives us ships raised from soil and sea, settlements traced through layers of ash and turf, and routes inferred from where people appeared and endured, but it cannot recover perception. It cannot excavate intuition, attention, or the silent judgments made in motion, moment by moment, on open water. These elements leave no clear imprint in the ground, yet they shaped every successful crossing. Still, the consistency of Viking expansion tells us something that cannot be dismissed. These voyages were repeatable. They were anticipated, and they were planned with confidence, rooted in experience rather than chance. The same routes were used across generations, relying on knowledge stable enough to survive centuries of change. The absence of maps is not evidence of ignorance or limitation. It is evidence of a fundamentally different relationship with the environment, one built on familiarity and trust, a relationship modern life rarely asks us to maintain. Failure at sea was never theoretical for Viking sailors. It carried no margin for reinterpretation or second chances. To be wrong on open water did not mean delay or discomfort. It meant disappearance, the kind that left no marker and no story to correct itself. Every successful crossing we can trace today quietly implies countless attempts that never returned, journeys that ended beyond memory, absorbed by distance and time. Navigation without instruments did not remove danger. It made danger visible and unavoidable. It demanded respect for limits, for weather that could not be argued with, for timing that could not be forced, and for the physical endurance of human bodies exposed to cold and exhaustion. The Vikings did not conquer the Atlantic through dominance or defiance. They negotiated with it, accepting that survival depended on humility as much as skill, and that the sea always retained the final word. When we ask how Vikings navigated the Atlantic without maps or compasses, we are really asking something quieter. We are asking how humans once trusted their relationship with the world more than their ability to control it. In an age of constant guidance, it is unsettling to realize that entire civilizations once moved across oceans, guided by memory, attention, and shared experience. Not because they lacked technology, but because they understood something we are only beginning to rediscover. If this story stirred something familiar, perhaps a family history of migration, settlement, labor, or survival passed down across generations, consider sharing that memory in the comments, because living history survives not in museums alone, but in the stories we choose to remember together. Liking, subscribing, and joining the conversation are not just gestures here. They are acts of preservation, small ways of keeping fragile knowledge from fading entirely. Because the deepest truth of Viking navigation is not that they crossed the ocean without maps. It is that they crossed it by listening, and the world still speaks, even if we have forgotten how to hear it.